Who is the real welterweight GOAT? When 2022 began, UFC bossman Dana White and many others were falling over themselves to proclaim that Kamaru Usman was the greatest welterweight of all time. Depending on your view of Georges St-Pierre and what he accomplished during his career, the argument Usman was the welterweight GOAT and not Rush may not have sat too well with you. Well, as you may know, a lot has gone down since 2022, and Usman is no longer holding the UFC's welterweight crown. So, can anyone still make the argument that Usman is the greatest? Or has GSP reclaimed his status as the real welterweight GOAT? Let's get into it by reviewing their key wins, their championship runs, as well as their defeats. Their key wins. GSP. Now, of course, anytime you talk about what a fighter has accomplished and where they sit in the GOAT debate, you have to look at the quality of their opposition and who they beat. This can be kind of tricky, as it's no secret fighters of today are way more well-rounded and skilled than the fighters of previous generations. I mean, let's be honest, back when Royce Gracie was winning UFC tourneys, you had a better chance of seeing a Sasquatch or Yeti walking through the streets than finding a gym that offered Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes. So, it's important to consider what the state of the game was at the time, when the fighter was scoring big wins and making waves in MMA. So, with that said, let's take a look at GSP's pivotal wins and championship runs. The Canadian star won his first UFC welterweight title all the way back in 2006 by taking out Matt Hughes with a head kick and follow-up punches. In doing so, he avenged his 2004 loss to the legendary Hughes. More on that in a minute. To receive that title fight with Hughes, St-Pierre defeated the likes of Frank Trigg, Sean Shirk, and BJ Penn. At that time, all three of those men were considered elite fighters, especially Penn, who for years was widely considered to be one of the greatest fighters of all time. For those folks who can look past the wince-inducing 7-fight losing streak Penn incurred before finally retiring, the prodigy still is. Now, St-Pierre's first title reign did come to a quick, jaw-dropping halt at the hands of Matt Serra. More on that in a minute as well. But during his second run as the welterweight champ, he recorded additional victories over Hughes and Penn, as well as 2 wins over Josh Koscheck. Koscheck was another dude who fought for too long and closed out his career with some ugly defeats. But on account of his ridiculously heavy hands and top-tier wrestling skills, Koscheck was widely viewed as a legit world-class welterweight during his prime. So already GSP's resume here is looking pretty good, and that's before noting he also defeated fighters like Carlos Condit, Dan Hardy, and Thiago Alves during their best years. All three were considered dangerous finishers, and GSP was able to shut them all down. Rush also defeated Jake Shields in 2011. And while Shields' detractors claimed they would have preferred to watch paint dry over watching him fight, there was no question the vaunted grappler was one of the best welterweights in the game. The same can be said about John Fitch. GSP outscored the very well-rounded fighter, who at the time had won 16 straight fights. Further, during the late stages of his second run as the welterweight champ, Rush defeated rival Nick Diaz, who during his prime gave many top fighters all sorts of trouble with his tricky boxing, dangerous ground game, and Stockton swagger. St-Pierre's final win at welterweight came over Johnny Hendricks in 2013. Now, sure, many called the fight for Hendricks, so there may be an asterisk beside that victory. But at the end of the day, a win is a win. And at the time, Hendricks was blasting dudes across the octagon with his booming left and takedowns. Just ask Martin Kampmann. Usman. Now let's take a look at Usman's pivotal victories to date. When you look at Usman's record, the first big name that pops out, in terms of a win, is Leon Edwards. Usman defeated him by decision back in 2015, which at the time was just his 7th fight. Of course, the Edwards chapter of Usman's career didn't end there, and we'll get into that more shortly. In the following years, as Usman worked his way into title contention, he defeated established fighters like Sean Strickland, Demian Maia, and Rafael dos Anjos. In the case of RDA, Usman notched a win over a former champ, albeit a former lightweight champ. But still, it was a big win nonetheless, as it moved Usman into a title fight with Tyron Woodley. Woodley has taken a lot of heat in recent years for looking ridiculously hesitant in big fights, and that was the case in his bout with Usman. But it wasn't that long ago when Woodley's name was also being dropped in welterweight GOAT debates. After taking the belt from Woodley, Usman proceeded to stop Colby Covington in their epic and thrilling 2019 war. On account of Covington's machine-like cardio, relentless pressure, and wrestling pedigree, he was, and still is, widely considered to be one of the best welterweights in the game. So that was also a big win for Usman, as was his second decision victory over Chaos in 2021. During Usman's run as the welterweight champ, he also defeated Jorge Masvidal not once but twice. The first time, the Nigerian star recorded a decision win over the dangerous veteran, before bombing him out in gasp-inducing fashion in 2021. Usman also took out the always dangerous and extremely well-rounded Gilbert Burns. So, on account of these impressive wins, as 2021 came to a close, a lot of folks were calling Usman the welterweight GOAT. So, who has the edge in the wins department? Now, strictly going off name recognition and accomplishments, one could certainly argue GSP has the edge over Usman. After all, we're talking about a guy who holds multiple wins over legends like Matt Hughes and BJ Penn, and who defeated multiple top-tier welterweights. But as we all know, how you rack up wins, and whether you do it in where were you in fashion, really matters with fans. GSP certainly had some memorable finishes over the likes of Hughes and Serra in their rematches, but even the biggest Rush fan will concede that his wrestling and grappling-centric style didn't always hype the masses. To be fair, the same could be said about Usman, earlier on his UFC run, before he took out Masvidal, Covington, and Burns in highlight reel fashion, which really put him over as a star. Conclusion: GSP takes the wins department by a slight margin. Their championship runs and stats, so we've gone over their key wins, but typically in GOAT debates, how long a fighter held the belt also carries a lot of weight. Here again, you have to go with GSP. While, as noted, GSP took a lot of heat during his championship runs for fighting too safe. At the end of the day, he recorded 12 welterweight championship wins, the most ever to date at 170. Further, in his second reign as champ, Rush defended the title 9 times in a row. That reign lasted approximately 6 years. Think about that for a second. Most fighters' careers don't last that long, never mind being champ in the world's biggest MMA organization in one of the deepest divisions in the game. Usman, meanwhile, defended the belt 5 times and held it for approximately half that time. So yeah, the checkmark here goes to St-Pierre, their defeats. While people always remember fighters for their big and memorable wins, the reality is they also recall the defeats, especially if they're one-sided, brutal losses. Now, in terms of losses that went down in the octagon, both Usman and GSP only have 2. That's pretty impressive in itself. St-Pierre's first loss came against the aforementioned Hughes way back in 2004. At the time, not only was Hughes widely considered to be one of the best welterweights on the planet, many saw him as one of the pound-for-pound best. So no shame there, other than the fact GSP was subbed in the opening round, and after making a glaring technical error. GSP's second loss, however, still to this day, remains one of the greatest upsets in combat sports history. The stunning defeat came against Serra in 2007, who had earned a title shot not because of key wins in the welterweight division, but because he had won the Ultimate Fighter. Insiders knew that Serra was a threat on account of his heavy hands and ground game. But still, the rematch reinforced the argument that at the end of the day, GSP should never have lost to Serra, period. Usman, as you surely know, is coming off back-to-back losses to Leon Edwards. Initially, the first defeat was also heralded as an upset, as Usman was clearly en route to winning the fight, before Edwards sent him to the land of shadows with a brutal head kick. The rubber match earlier in 2023 was far more competitive from the opening horn, and while Edwards didn't record a finish, he did walk away with the decision win. So, what's the takeaway here? Even before Edwards fought Usman for a second time, Rocky had established himself as one of the best welterweights on the planet. This is a man who hasn't lost a fight since 2015. So in a way, you could make the argument that GSP's defeats in sum were more detrimental to his resume than Usman's. But if Usman had never lost to Edwards at all, then we'd be talking about a fighter who has no losses in a decade, and who has never lost in the octagon to date. Usman would also still be the welterweight champ. In that scenario, Usman's case for being the welterweight GOAT would be much, much stronger. So who is the welterweight GOAT? If we were having this discussion back in 2022, when Usman was sitting atop of the welterweight division and wrecking the opposition, the argument to call him the welterweight GOAT was much more compelling. At the time, not too many people saw him losing to Edwards even once, much less twice. In other words, as things stand right now here in 2023, Mr. St-Pierre should be regarded as the welterweight GOAT. Now, could Usman go on another run and end his fighting days as the consensus welterweight GOAT? Anything's possible, right? While the Nigerian Nightmare is turning 36 in 2023, if he can stay healthy and active and work his way back to the title with some emphatic victories, the GOAT talk will almost certainly spike again. But what do you think? Is GSP the welterweight GOAT? Or do you think Usman is the greatest, despite his setbacks to Rocky? Or could we be witnessing the start of a GOAT run, courtesy of Edwards? Let us know in the comment section, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and to subscribe to KO Central MMA.